Chapter 6, The Pest, Antony's POV. So, Antony tried for an offhanded tone, what do you two think of this group of offerings? He'd grabbed his maps and papers and vacated his chambers as soon as the bell had indicated it was safe to go above deck. Sure enough, his two lieutenants were waiting in the conference room with their own bundles of notes and plans. They spent a few hours comparing their ideas and working out a complete strategy for dealing with the Surgish raiders, and Antony felt that some small talk wouldn't seem strange at this point. Theodora looked surprised, and Marcus grinned wolfishly. Why, I think it's the finest in some time. My boy is absolutely delectable. Fine blood, a sweet tight body, and the most talented little mouth besides. It was a struggle to leave my chambers tonight, I'll have you know. It was terribly generous of you to leave me with the pick of the litter this time, Antony. I'd suggest we withdraw so I could show you my appreciation, but the boy has me quite worn out at the moment. Antony rolled his eyes. I might have known. What about you, Theodora? How's yours? He's fine. She shrugged her broad shoulders. Polite and willing as always. A good boy. His name's Kenta. He's a little seasick, but once he's feeling better, I'm sure his blood will taste wonderful. Is that really all the enthusiasm you can muster? Marcus demanded. I'm not interested in them the same way you are. Theo shrugged. If any of them are actually women, they won't say as much until they've had time to get comfortable. That's what comes of demanding men for the offering and then defining men as anyone born with a prick. On average, the ones born with pricks have more blood than the ones born without, Antony said for what must have been the 10,000th time. That's what the sacrifices are for, remember? Blood, thick red substance, keeps us alive. But it's only the tiniest part of what makes life worth living, Marcus sighed. I remember your boy from the ceremony, Theo. He had the most gorgeous little round ass, not that you care. What a waste. I don't suppose you could be persuaded to share? Theodora's eyes narrowed. Touch any of my boys. Go on. I'll pull off your skin and use your dick to bait a fish hook. Marcus and Antony laughed, Antony a bit nervously. His stomach flipped and he instinctively pulled his knees tightly together. He was suddenly even more relieved that he hadn't done anything to Theodora's human when he'd interrupted them the other day. What about yours, Antony? Marcus asked when his mirth had died down. I must say I was surprised when you chose from the back row. His hair is unusual, Antony explained. I thought he might be fun to paint. Marcus groaned loudly. You two are impossible. You choose a gorgeous slave boy with years of training and service and pleasure, and you want him to be a pet or an artist's model. A meal, Antony corrected. They're meals, Marcus, not concubines. They're both, and you know it, and your brother and sister know it too, Marcus smiled. Otherwise, why would you exalted three have told the priest to include fucking in their curriculum? Claudia handled all those details, Antony snapped, though in truth it had all been so long ago that the memory was a bit fuzzy. Regardless, do you think your pretty little muse will finally tempt you to put that training to the test? Marcus asked with a long, lazy smile. It was a familiar, infuriating expression, and it made a blessed change from all the beaming Antony had been subjected to for the last several hours. Heavens, no! He was a little astonished at the vehemence in his own tone. The brat's blood is delicious, but he's a damned pest. He'll be lucky if I don't rip his irritating little face off before the 6 years are up. His lieutenants blinked at him for a moment, then Theodora smirked broadly and Marcus barked out a fresh laugh. Oh dear, how did the little human slave manage to offend the mighty blood god so quickly? I have to work hard to get you this annoyed. Antony stonily ignored his chortling. I can't help wondering if the boy is off in the head. The only times he hasn't been bouncing around with an idiotic grin were when he was snoring through the night or sobbing his eyes out into his breakfast because I scolded him. Scolded him, I might add, for spitting a mouthful of half-eaten food across the table. He wouldn't mention the laughing. It was only in the last century or two that Marcus had finally stopped needling him for being too soft. It wouldn't do to let his lover know what he'd permitted the human boy to get away with today. Oh! Marcus laughed harder, oblivious to Antony's thoughts. Oh no! Are you sure he's quite housebroken? Oh dear! He collected himself, arranged his face into a haughty glare, and shifted his voice into what was clearly an exaggeration of Antony's own. Now remember, Antony, you have to make him last for the full 6 years. If you lose your temper and crack his head open before then, I'm not going to let you choose another. You'll have to drink from the communal stock like everyone else. Yes, all right, you've made your point, Antony grumbled. And I'm not going to lose my temper. If I've put up with you all this time, I can handle this human for 6 years. Now go fuck your new toy, I'm sick of looking at you. Marcus grinned. I'd argue, but that's too tempting in order to resist. Your wish is my command, my lord. Send someone for me when it's time to go ashore. I don't think I'll budge from my chambers until then. He swept a low bow and walked out the door, still laughing. Theodora didn't move. She was still looking at Antony, and he thought her smirk had an unusually kind edge to it. He suddenly remembered the nights hundreds of years ago when he'd crept into her rooms before dawn and she'd let him in and allowed him to curl up beside her on her bed and sob into her strong shoulder until he drifted into an uneasy sleep. He shoved the thought hastily away and let his face fall into a scowl. He didn't like remembering those days. Don't mind Marcus, Theodora said. You listen to him too much. He's wrong. You got a good boy. Did I? Antony snapped, hating himself for the harshness of his voice. He knew he was irrationally angry because her kindness was dredging up old memories best left alone, but he couldn't restrain his menacing tone. Theodora was, as always, unbothered by his temper. Yes, I was going to choose him if you didn't. He was fidgeting as he bowed. Really? That surprised Antony right out of his irritation. Why on earth would you pick him because of that? I always pick ones that seem to have some personality, Theodora replied. Your boy's brimming with it. An irritating personality, Antony grumbled, and she shrugged, scratching at her crooked, many times broken nose. Does it matter? There's 50 of us on a little ship. We've floated around together for 1,000 years. We'll be floating around together in 1,000 more, the same 50. We see the others now and then, but that's all. Isn't it good to have someone different around? He's not someone, he's a human, Antony objected. So what? He says things you haven't heard and thinks thoughts you can't predict. Can you say the same about any of the rest of us? Antony wasn't convinced, but Theodora went on. He wasn't sure when he'd last heard so many words at once from his reliable pilot and navigator. The priests try to train all the personality out of them. They want to make them subservient and silent. But I like to have interesting people around me. Usually it takes me years to find the interesting person buried under the perfect slave. It'll take a few years with Kenta. But your boy's too bright and lively to keep himself hidden. You should enjoy that. She smiled and stretched in her chair, biceps bulging against the sleeves of her shirt. Antony wished he'd exercised more when he'd had the chance. Between Theodora and Marcus, he felt like a scrawny weakling. I'd like to talk with him sometime, if you'll permit it. If Hanyu can do one thing, he can talk, Antony grumbled. Theodora's eyes widened and she sat up straight. Hanyu? She repeated. His name? What else would it be? Antony didn't know what to make of her response. Theodora's smile brightened. You learned his name. That's wonderful, Antony. I never said so, but it scared me a little when you stopped asking their names. Antony blinked, dumbfounded. What do you mean? Theodora got to her feet. I have things to do, but I'll say this. You may not want to hear it, but I think this irritating little Hanyu is good for you. Hanyu's POV. Hanyu had always known he was a terrible offering. He'd hoped that it was just his constant proximity to the effortless perfection of a sow that made him feel this way, but he'd always doubted that. This afternoon, time was slippery in the torchlit chamber, proved once and for all how futile those hopes were. Today he'd had no Asau to contrast his own behavior with, only the most basic standards of protocol, service, and rudimentary table manners. And against even those minimal standards, he'd failed more wretchedly than he'd ever imagined he could, even in his dourest imaginings. After Lord Antony had spoken so coldly, he'd been sure he was going to be replaced. He couldn't blame the god. Even a human master probably wouldn't have put up with such a ridiculous display from a slave. But Hanyu had felt so unexpectedly wretched at the idea of being sent away. He didn't want to lose the status of personal attendant, of course, but he also didn't want to lose the chance to attend Lord Antony. He wanted to keep listening to his lovely voice and looking in his silver eyes. He wanted a chance to prove himself to the pretty god, not leave him thinking of Hanyu as some filthy, half-civilized fool. It had been astonishing when Lord Antony had said he didn't intend to get rid of Hanyu. An overwhelming wave of gratitude and joy had crashed over him, and he'd had to fight the desire to throw his arms around the god and jump up and down like he'd do with the sow. It had also been hard work to keep back tears of gratitude and joy, though he fought them down in an effort to obey Lord Antony's instruction to stop sniveling. He was so glad to have a second chance to prove himself an acceptable attendant. At least he knew his role now. Keep the chambers in order. He'd ensure that the god's rooms had never looked so good. When the attendant came to collect Hanyu's breakfast dishes, he asked for cleaning supplies. After a while, the man returned with a box of them, which Hanyu stashed in his personal closet. It made the space even more cramped than it already was, but he wasn't sure where else to put the box so it wouldn't be in Lord Antony's way. Then Hanyu cleaned. He polished the wooden table until it shone in the torchlight, and no one would ever believe that it had been splattered with half-chewed eggs. He polished the sconces, even though the heat of the torches hurt his hands, and he worried that his rag might catch fire. He polished the doors, the walls, the frames of the paintings. He polished the legs of the sofa. He didn't dare enter Lord Antony's bedchambers without permission, but he polished every smooth surface in the sitting room until it gleamed as bright as the god's eyes. He'd just moved on to brushing the carpets when the door opened and Lord Antony returned. Since Hanyu was already kneeling, it was easy to drop into his full bow. "Welcome back, my lord," he greeted the god. "I'm so happy to see you." There was a moment's silence, and Hanyu had to fight the urge to peer up and try to read Lord Antony's expression. A bristle poked his forehead, and he realized he still had a hand on the carpet brush. Should he push it away? No, if his master had somehow failed to notice the brush, that would only draw his eye for sure. Best simply to act as if it was supposed to be there. "It seems Theodora was right," Lord Antony said at last. "You really do fidget when you bow. I hadn't noticed." Hanyu wasn't sure how to respond to that. "I'm sorry," he tried after another silent moment. "Why? It does neither of us any harm. Get up now, boy, and put that damn brush away." Hanyu rushed to obey. He skittered into the closet and dropped the brush back into his new box of cleaning supplies, then dashed back to where Lord Antony was standing in the middle of the room. Immediately, he was faced with a new problem. He stood in the god's presence a number of times that morning. Silver eyes glinted up at him, cool and contemplative, and Hanyu shifted uneasily on his feet. His stomach churned at the wrongness of looking down at a god. He wanted to sink to his knees, if not into a full bow, but the last order Lord Antony had given him had been to get up, and he didn't think he should risk it. He hunched his shoulders again and tried to look smaller. Lord Antony squinted at him, then the corner of his mouth twitched. A second later, he burst out laughing. Hanyu stood frozen in astonishment. As much time as he'd spent trying to make his friends laugh back at the temple when they were growing up, it had never occurred to him that he might be able to make a god laugh. Shit, it had never occurred to him that the gods laughed at all. Lord Antony certainly hadn't given any prior indication of being prone to gales of mirth. Though he'd been wonderfully kind and patient, he was still a lord among the gods and a bit forbidding. But now the god's shoulders were shaking, and he'd put a long-fingered hand over his mouth. His laugh was shaky and higher pitched than his speaking voice, and it was also the loveliest sound Hanyu had ever heard in his life. A grin crept irrepressibly across his face, so wide that his cheeks hurt. "Oh, for goodness sakes, boy," his god finally choked out. "Stand up straight. I promise I'm not saying this to frighten you, but I'm over 1,000 years old, and I could rip you in half without a second's trouble. Are you really afraid I'll be bothered that you're taller than I am?" When Lord Antony put it like that, Hanyu had to admit that it was a little ridiculous. He laughed as well, unable to resist his master's continuing chuckles. "Well, all right, my lord, that makes sense." He stood up straight, as ordered, and beamed down at his god. Lord Antony's laughter had subsided, but he kept peering curiously up at Hanyu. Finally, his lips canted up into a smile that was oddly small and hesitant. Hanyu felt as if his insides had liquefied. His bare toes curled into the soft carpet, and sudden, inexplicable tears threatened. He wanted to keep doing things to earn that little smile. He wanted to kiss it right off those thin, dark lips. He enjoyed it so much that he didn't even think to be excited that he'd made a god smile at him until several moments had passed and his heart had started beating normally again. "Have you had your dinner?" Lord Antony asked at last. Yes, my lord, Hanyu replied. He felt a tiny quiver of apprehension and darted a nervous look down at his god. His urge to weep for joy dissipated. Was that all right? Should I have waited? What did I just tell you, boy? I have better things to do than spend every minute telling you whether you can eat or not. I simply wanted to be sure you'd had your meal before dousing the torches so you can get some sleep. The attendants will be taking all of you to the topmost deck tomorrow for some exercise and a bit of sun, so you'll need to be rested. Oh, yes! It would be so incredibly good to see the sun again, but there were other, even more enticing possibilities in that statement. Do we all go up at once, my lord? Yes, I believe so. Lord Antony was already dousing the first torch. Hanyu's heart bounded joyously. He'd get to see Asao, and Jen, and Taiki, and Kenta, and everyone. He hoped Asao was over his shock from the claiming ceremony. He seemed almost angry with Hanyu on their way to the ship, but surely that had passed when he'd had time to get used to the idea of Hanyu belonging to Lord Antony instead of him. After all, he belonged to Lord Marcus, the famous war chief, and that was nearly as good. Besides, Asao had never held grudges before. It would be all right. All right, pet, go to bed, Lord Antony ordered, interrupting Hanyu's thoughts. He saw that the god had doused all but one torch and stood ready next to it. Hanyu's elation deflated a bit. He'd thought that after making the god laugh, perhaps... Out here, my lord? He dared to ask. Lord Antony's face hardened. Yes, he said. Now. Hanyu hurried to obey and kept his head bowed to hide the tears that started when the final torch went out, leaving him in total darkness, and spilled over his cheeks when the god's door shut firmly between them.